gentle listener, and welcome to Nocturnal Transmissions, the fortnightly podcast that brings you dark tales, both old and new, performed by your humble narrator, Kristin Holland. So, you may have noticed that we put an adult advisory warning on this episode. Truth be told, being a horror-themed podcast, the majority of our content is, to varying degrees, worthy of some manner of warning. However, we assume that you know what you're signing on for when you select to listen to a show like this, and save our warnings for when we feature a tale that is particularly sexually explicit or in some other manner alarming. And that brings us to the garden. Now, this one falls into the sexually explicit, and alarming camp, for that matter. Well, it's not all that sexually explicit. I mean, it's no alchemical wedding, episode 68 if you're in the mood, as it were. But it might be a little naughty for the young, and certainly triggering, for want of a better term, in more ways than one. So, you have been warned. Oh, I hasten to add that we wouldn't want this warning to put off any of our stout-of-heart, age-appropriate listeners, as this mean little story really is, well, horrific. And isn't that what we're all here for? So, I guess we better get to it and see what all the fuss is about. Nocturnal Transmissions is proud to present The Garden by Dark Rhodes. Her departure had been quick and certain. A slammed door and a wedding band he'd find on their dresser several days after she'd gone. He'd asked himself over and over when their love had turned to contempt, but could never pinpoint an exact moment. It was a slowly manifesting cancer, an invisible rot that had set in and corroded the foundation of their once promising relationship, reducing everything that brought them together to ash and dust. The beginning of the end, he knew, had stemmed from their inability to conceive. At first, they'd assumed it was her parts that were malfunctioning, but they soon discovered that he was the one who was cursed. What hurt him most was that in the brief time they'd suspected that she was sterile, the thought of leaving her had never once crossed his mind. However, as soon as the tables had turned, everything changed. She began to view him more as an old piece of furniture in need of replacement than the man she'd been in love with for nearly a decade. There were no immediate plans for separation, just a slow build, during which the fights became more frequent, the threats more severe, and the silence in between more prolonged. He hated to speculate, but it seemed as if his wife knew the end was imminent and had slowly begun to pull away. She'd stopped trying to fix things, and subtly encouraged him to do the same. His attempts to rekindle their affection for one another were deflected, and his optimistic approach infuriated her. She was perturbed by the fact that if she wanted out of their fractured marriage, she'd have to make the first move. There was no contentious event that instigated her departure. It was, by their new standards, a pretty normal evening, where they'd just sat down for another awkward dinner. As he ate his bland, microwaved meal, she sat across from him, staring out the dining room window, entranced by the falling rain. While he scraped the remnants of food from his plastic container, She looked at him like she'd cracked some important truth that had evaded her for months. "I've got to go," she said, casually, as if she'd just recalled a dental appointment or a lunch with an old friend. Before he could respond, the legs of her chair screeched against the hardwood floor, and she stood, excusing herself from the table. While he was loading the dishwasher, she entered the kitchen with 2 lumpy suitcases, and he stopped what he was doing to face her. He thought that after all this time spent staring at the cruel writing on the wall, he'd be prepared for her to leave. But the reality of it took his breath away. He could only look at her with the puzzlement of a child that was being forced to go along with a decision made by the grown-ups. "I'm sorry," she began, though whether she meant it he couldn't tell. "I feel like I was put on this earth to be a mother. And no matter how hard I've tried to convince myself that I don't need that our love is more important, I can't. I'm sorry, but there's no future for us without that." Thousands of ideas bounced around his head, sentences he should form to convince her to stay, but each potential move fell short of matching the unbeatable hand she'd stacked against him. She waited for him to speak, to say anything, but when he didn't, she left. He didn't think that she meant to slam the door behind her, but she did, and it felt oddly appropriate. Through the kitchen window, he watched as she rushed to her car amidst the pouring rain, tossed her luggage in the back seat, and drove away. Where she was going, he didn't know. Neither of them had much family, and their limited number of friends weren't the type they could spontaneously borrow a room from. It wasn't until much later that he was able to pry himself away from his spot at the sink and climb into a bed that felt too big without her. His mind was too restless to sleep, and too blank to answer the many questions she'd left him with. So he spent that night flipping through the various stages of grief, as frequently as he shifted his position on the mattress. The next morning he returned to the kitchen, where he stood like a dog, waiting for its owner to come home. After an hour, when no car appeared in the driveway, he did what any newly anointed bachelor would, and got good and drunk. He thought he called her, but the details of that bender were fuzzy. When he checked his phone the next day, he saw that he had, but she hadn't picked up or called him back. Along with incredulity and regret, a new feeling had emerged. Fear. Fear that this was not some ordinary fight that would blow over. Fear that his wife would not return. He became acutely aware that their marriage had been on life support for months, and last night his wife had finally decided to pull the plug. When he accepted this, the death of something he loved more than anything, all he could do was keep drinking. The days turned into weeks, and then the weeks turned into months. Slowly, the weight of his wife's absence became a part of him, expanding from within like an inoperable tumor. He resigned himself to this next lonely chapter of his life and shuffled about it mindlessly. There was a lot of drinking and half-hearted soul-searching, but the things he learned about himself only led to more questions. He found that keeping busy was the only way he could forget her and his own shortcomings. His job as a jack-of-all-trades handyman occupied much of his days, but he ached during the long nights and weekends. Eventually, he found a new hobby to fill that unbearable time alone. In a corner of his 1-acre backyard, nestled beside a tall oak tree, he excavated a section of land, roughly 5 by 12 feet, and filled the plot with piles of mulch and dirt. Memories of his childhood, the only good ones from his youth, were of his mother tending to a garden very much like the one he had constructed, and he found this new project to be peaceful and productive. He spent long stretches out there, oftentimes staying hours after his work was complete, sprawled out, sipping a beer and carrying on a conversation with his plants, as if they were his closest friends. The occupants of his garden varied, but most were vegetables that could withstand the climatic conditions he had to work with. He loved each of his plants dearly, and was pleasantly surprised, even joyful, when large blossoms of lettuce, tall tomato-bearing vines, and leafy pepper plants appeared like magic. There was one plant, though, that quickly stood out and became that which he treasured most. Its origins eluded him, misplaced by one of the handful of vendors from which he'd purchased his family of crops, but there was no denying an unmistakable connection that he felt with it. Part of what drew him to it was its durability and tenacity. When he'd planted the mysterious sprout, it had been little more than a twig, protruding from the topsoil as if in defiance of its limited chances of survival. Every time there was a storm or a drought that should have resulted in its extinction, it greeted him the next day like it was surprised that its perseverance had ever been in question. It was through these encounters that he grew closer to the plant, and over several weeks it rose about 2 feet out of the garden. Then, one night, something happened to solidify their bond, convincing him that it held the answer to his problems. The setting sun had all but disappeared. What remained was blocked from his view by the crooked oak that loomed like a gargoyle overlooking his beloved garden. It left behind a pink and orange hue that filled him with a frustrating sense of sadness, because he wished he was not alone in admiring this scene, that his wife was with him, resting her head on his shoulder. He added another empty beer can to the scattered pile he'd built beside him instead. All afternoon it had been still and humid, as if the world had forgotten how to breathe. But just as he'd popped the tab on another beer, a gust of wind swept through his thinning hair. For a moment he basked in the refreshing breeze, allowing it to dry the layer of sweat that had accumulated on his forehead, a compliment to the perfect summer evening. It was then that he first heard the voice in the wind, as natural to him as the setting sun. The voice was not male or female, but sounded as if it belonged solely to the earth, too powerful to be restricted by the confines of gender. It began as a whisper, a murmur of fragmented words he could neither decipher or retain. But as the breeze picked up, the voice grew louder, and he listened intently to its strange instruction. It told him that everything he wanted, his wife, a family, could be had if he only followed its direction. What was required seemed preposterous and foul, and the person he used to be would have rejected the proposal immediately. But in his current state, it made sense, was even logical. He learned that the plant he had grown so fond of, if cultivated properly, could remove the insurmountable obstacle that had destroyed his marriage. Even for a man as desperate as he, it was a tall order to blindly commit to a force he didn't understand. But the alternative seemed worse. One direction brought hope, while in the other there was nothing but more longing and despair. With its message delivered, the voice diminished in the wind, and he was suddenly aware of how dark it had become. Deciding he would start the next day, he said goodnight to his plants and stumbled back to his house, buzzing bad off beer and the excitement of what had just happened to him. He slept well that night, comforted by the promise of tomorrow and the better days he hoped it would bring. A whisper in his ear pulled him from the fragments of a dream, and he shot up in bed, searching for its source, only to find that he was alone. The darkness indicated that it was still early, much too early for a Saturday, and he briefly debated going back to sleep. His head was throbbing, and his throat was dry. The need to alleviate this self-inflicted discomfort propelled him from his bed and into the bathroom across the hall. Once there, he slugged a glass of water and an amount of pain medication that exceeded the recommended dose before staring into the dusty mirror above the sink. While he stood in the cramped bathroom, catching his breath before he chugged more water, the memory of last night burst into his mind, as sharp and direct as the headache he'd woken up to. He recalled the voice and what he'd agreed to. Unlike typical drunk decision-making, he felt better about his mission than he did last night. The possibilities surrounding it allowed hope and purpose to penetrate the depression that occupied his sobriety. There was no going back to bed now. It was time to get to work. The jeans and t-shirt he'd worn the previous evening sat in a crumpled pile on his bedroom floor. He picked them up and shook them out before putting them back on. The sun had slowly begun its ascent, still tucked behind the tree line, but providing a soft orange glow that would be all the light he'd need. He slipped out the back door and crossed the yard, kicking up droplets of dew that clung to the bottoms of his jeans as he went. When he made it to the garden, he paused, a sense of calmness washing over him as he breathed in the crisp morning air. His marching orders direct, he opted not to overthink things as he set about his task. He knelt in the dirt beside his coveted plant and used 2 fingers to dig a slender hole about 6 inches deep. With his point of entry created, he removed his boots and pants and stroked himself until he was ready. It felt oddly demoralizing at first, but this was the only way to reach his wife. So he laid down by the plant and inserted himself into the soil. Although it was a difficult angle, he began to thrust, the frantic rhythm of his body matched by a restless breeze, encouraging him to release himself into the plant's roots. He found the ordeal to be strangely erotic, and it didn't take him long to hold up his end of the bargain. His climax was fierce and cleansing, a release of the emotional weight he'd been carrying. It was the first time since she'd left that he was able to feel something other than pain. He lifted himself off the ground, wiping dirt off his face and chest before putting his clothes back on and sitting beside the garden. Now, all he could do was wait. He realized that these things take time, but rather than find comfort in the work he'd done, he became anxious at the thought of his helplessness in this stage of the process. Similar to the way in which he managed his broken heart, he resorted to distraction to pull his mind away from the agony of waiting. He returned to the house and entered the kitchen, where he bypassed the disapproving stare of his coffee maker and pulled a beer from the fridge instead. This was, after all, a day of celebration, and he could view the alcohol as a reward rather than a necessity. As he drank his beer, he moved into the living room and stared at the pictures of him and his wife that hung from the wall. The melancholy he normally experienced when he passed the pictures was absent, and he smiled to himself. This felt like progress. He finished his first drink and grabbed a fresh one before stepping out the back door. Fixed to the side of the house was a long green hose that he used to fill the rusty watering can stowed next to it. The water sloshed dangerously close to the top of the can as he trudged to the garden, and his arm ached by the time he reached it. He set his beer down so that he could tilt the heavy spout over the remainder of his harvest. When he'd finished, he got down on his hands and knees and observed the special plant, inspecting it for any sign of change, but finding nothing. He knew that demanding results so soon would only set himself up for disappointment, so he took a breath, attempting to physically suppress his anxiety and doubt. Breathing exercises didn't help, but more beer would. He finished his drink before trotting back to the kitchen, where he would spend the rest of the day inebriated, avoiding thoughts about the seed he'd planted in his garden. Over the next several weeks, he continued to perform his strange ritual, the voice waking him up before dawn and pulling him to the garden. He didn't even bother to put his clothes on anymore, but would stumble out of the house completely naked before penetrating the ground. There were several points at which he wanted to abandon his assignment, chalking the entire period up as an embarrassing delusion. But then things started happening that convinced him that what he was doing was working. The first sign of change was the withering death of all his other plants. The lettuce heads browned and the pepper plants lost their leaves. None of his harvest survived the sudden ecocide, except the centerpiece of his bizarre experiment. That plant, which was once nothing but a stick in the mud, seemed to flourish, first spreading long viney branches, then vibrant green buds that bloomed into rhombic leaves. He became mesmerized, even obsessed with the plant's impossible progress, and was soon spending every free moment he had in his garden. The plant continued to blossom before his eyes, and about a month after it had gone green, he noticed another development, a new growth that he was certain was the reward for his efforts. It was a thick, red vine that wound itself from the top of the plant stem downwards towards the dirt. As it matured, a crimson bulb emerged near the base of the stem, barely visible behind the abundant leaves. He studied the bulb, and the more he did, the more he became convinced that it was unlike any flower he'd ever seen before. The outer shell was translucent and delicate, a glassy shield encasing a crimson fluid that was the source of its blood-red glow. There was something else inside the bulb. At first he thought he was seeing things, but as its circumference expanded from the size of a walnut to that of a football, he could not deny what he was witnessing. What began as a small black mass grew congruently with the bulb, evolving into an embryonic child with a head and arms and legs. His first instinct was to tell his wife and hope that it was enough to bring her home. He thought back to the year they'd spent trying to do exactly what he'd done by himself, and he felt a wave of sadness as he relived each painful moment of failure. A waste paper basket full of negative pregnancy tests, an empty crib, a doctor shaking her head regretfully. He decided it was too early to call his wife, that he didn't want to get her hopes up again, only to have them shattered when another complication arose. He also didn't know how he could possibly explain this miracle, and he needed more time to figure that out. So, for now, he'd wait. He felt rejuvenated in the way one does when they've overcome incredible odds and proven their doubters wrong. That night, he dusted off the expensive bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for the moment he knew he was going to be a father, and sat by the garden and drank. After he'd polished off most of the fifth, he fell into a deep sleep. His dreams were strange and troubling, littered with images of his wife, though not the welcoming incarnation that he'd anticipated. She stared at him from across the garden, wearing the same grey crewneck and jeans she'd had on the night she left. She was crying and staring down at her feet as if she were afraid to look at him. Seeing her like that provoked a deep feeling of regret. He moved towards her, wishing to hold her and take her pain away. But she grew frantic as he approached. Before he could reach her, the plant, the object of his fascination, wrapped its long, sturdy vines around her in a deadly embrace. She screamed for help, but all he could do was stand there, rooted to the ground like the old oak that passively watched the interaction. The wind picked up, adding to the chaos, and his wife's panic escalated as the ground parted, and the plant pulled her into the dirt. Her hands clawed at the soil before it closed in on her. When she was tucked away, the red bulb pulsated and glowed in the dark, and he puked down the front of his shirt. He awoke, nearly choking on his vomit, and rolled over to retch in the grass. Getting to his feet, he ran back to the house, afraid of facing the garden and a nightmare far too realistic for him to process. On a night that should have been filled with happiness and celebration, he laid in bed and felt nothing but doubt and whiskey swirling like battery acid in his stomach. He wanted to sleep, but was terrified of what else his dreams might show him. So he stayed like that until morning. When the sun rose, he lifted himself from the musky mattress and got dressed for the day. He didn't understand the dream, nor did he want to, so he simply elected to let it go, to bury it in the dirt of his mind, and hope that nothing sprouted from the seed. He wasn't sure how he knew, but he did. After months of waiting and monitoring the growing bulb, he could tell that its development was almost complete, and he'd soon deliver what it had produced. He'd all but stopped working, dedicating his time to caring for the plant and researching the complexities of childbirth. When he wasn't in the garden, he could be found in the room he and his wife had dedicated to the baby they were never able to produce. He had dusted off the crib and sanded and polished the antique rocking chair that sat beside it, electing to sleep in the old chair most nights. The day of the delivery rolled in with a series of vicious thunderstorms that were characterized by heavy winds and rain that shook the foundation of his farmhouse. The bulb was slightly larger than a basketball and now boasted a fully developed child. Sensing it was set to open, he'd put on his slicker and stationed himself beside the garden. He waited out there all day, drinking the case of beer he'd brought with him, wondering not only if he'd be able to deliver the baby, but if he was capable of being a good father. He couldn't confirm or deny either, but decided that he would try his best and hope that was enough. Spiteful clouds hung above him, making the whole day seem dark, but at a certain point the temperature dropped, and the cloud started to dissolve into the black of night. As the darkness around him intensified, the plant became active, groaning and shifting in the storm as if waking from a deep sleep. He took a swig of warm beer and readied himself for the culmination of his efforts, the event that was several arduous months in the making. Tossing his empty to the side, he got to his feet and approached the contracting plant. He carried with him a pair of garden shears and a stack of folded linens that, despite his best efforts, had been soaked by the constant rain. Deep in the throes of labor, the plant became increasingly agitated. Its leafy vines swung recklessly, and he was forced to dodge the barrage of tangled attacks or be knocked to the dirt. After a brief episode of convulsions, the vegetal deliverer steadied, digging its green extremities into the earth as if attempting to find purchase there, and allowing him to move closer to its delicate flower. Even in the dark, he was able to distinguish the anguished throbbing of the bulb and could see movement inside as his child awoke from its prenatal hibernation. He knelt in front of it and then opened the shears, using the top blade to cut through the tough outer shell, the only thing separating him from his firstborn. The plant writhed as he began to cut, and he worried it would try to stop him, but despite the frenzied swirl of foliage that accompanied his incision, it permitted him to continue. As he dragged the sharp blade down the front of the bulb, the crimson fluid spilled onto him, and the sound of a crying baby rang out, penetrating the howl of the wind. When the slit was big enough, he reached in and pulled the child out, holding it in his arms as he cut the umbilical cord. Before he bundled the infant in his driest blanket, he raised him in the air and was filled with pride and joy. It was a boy. He carried the child from the garden and sat down on the wet grass, gently brushing the rain and fluids from his tiny face. The boy cried and screamed as he adjusted to life outside of his botanical womb, the cold wind and rain coming as a shock to his system. He knew he needed to get the newborn to shelter, but he lingered for one moment to admire its innocent beauty. Even in the darkness, he could see his son had his eyes and nose. He felt something he'd never experienced before bloom inside his chest. It was unconditional love. The complete disregard for all things that stood in the way of protecting the fragile being he held in his arms. He watched in wonder as his son's tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb, and it was then that he knew that everything they'd been through had been worth it for that moment. Right as he was about to head back towards the house, his son began to cough and sputter as if he were choking. The piercing cries were replaced by gurgled breathing, which indicated something was blocking his windpipe. Facing his first test as a father, he began to panic. He hadn't properly prepared for something like this, so he beat on the boy's small chest, frantically attempting to dislodge whatever it was that was blocking his airway. With nothing seeming to work, he resorted to shaking the boy violently and hammering his open palm against his back, begging him to breathe again. After several excruciating minutes, the sounds coming from the boy stopped, and he fell completely still. It was clear from the polarizing silence that his son was dead. that in a span of about 10 minutes, he'd not only taken his first breath, but also his last. Utterly alone again, he screamed at the sky, cursing at first, but soon no words escaped him, only deposits of the pain that had accumulated since his wife left. The sudden emotional transition from the happiest moment of his life to the worst proved to be too much for him, and he was left with only two options. He could die right there in the mud from a broken heart, or he could act on the rage that seized him. He decided upon the latter and enclosed his dead son in the blanket before retrieving the axe he kept by the woodpile. He twirled the handle in his hands and then gripped it tight as he approached the plant that had given him so much, only to snatch it away. The voice he'd heard those many nights ago urged him to stop, but he was too incensed to listen. The rain fell harder than it had all day, and the wind raged as if it too were trying to deter him. These warning signs went unnoticed as he stood on the sidelines of the garden and scanned his enemy for any signs of weakness. He decided to destroy its stem, and he put his head down and charged. Sensing his aggression, the plant became more animated than he'd ever seen it, its roots ripping up from the ground so that it towered above him, challenging him. After unearthing itself, it moved with vertical capability, using its half-dozen vines like tentacles to beat and grab at his body, but he swung the axe assiduously and cut each of them away. Each time his axe connected, he moved closer to the plant's core. Once there, he wasted no time in hacking at the stem and exposing the roots. He unleashed every ounce of his anger and grief, killing the one thing that had given him purpose again. In a final, desperate attempt to save itself, the hole left behind by the severed plant screeched for help, echoing in a combination of his wife's voice and the wail of his dead son. He screamed back, as if by doing so he could drown out the cries. But no matter how loud he yelled, their deafening sound still rang around his head. When he could no longer take it, he hoisted the axe high and brought it down into the very center of the desecrated plant. The screams and the violent thunderstorm stopped, but were replaced by an equally unbearable silence. His mission complete, he sat beside the hole, placing his head in his hands, and sobbed. His anger subsided, and in its place, the ferocious weight of grief seeped into his bones like the torrential rain had moments before. He wept. After suffering through the initial shock, he lifted his head from his hands and stared down at the hole. He was about to get up, grab a beer, and drink away this pain. But as he stood, something in the earth caught his eye. He used his hands to expand the hole, allowing him to properly explore the opening. As the hole grew, so did the fear in his chest. Fear of an incomprehensible truth he'd been avoiding for so long. Yet there was no going back now. All he could do was keep digging towards the answers that part of him knew he'd be unable to live with. He'd reached about a foot down when his fingers plunged into something he knew didn't belong. He pulled more dirt away, gentler now, and after a few handfuls, his wife's face stared back at him. Her skin was pale and bloated, rot having set in, and a festering of maggots crawled around her mouth that was permanently agape in horror. He fell backwards, then used his hands and feet to propel himself away from his wife's shallow grave. A blaze of agony roared through his head as memories of the night he killed her returned to him with stunning clarity. It was all as he initially remembered, until the point at which she tried to leave, and then the scene splintered off into a new direction. Unable to convince her to stay, he had resorted to force, grabbing her from behind and pinning her to the foyer floor. His frustration at himself for not being able to give her the baby she needed spilled out of him, and he squeezed her throat until she stopped moving. On a night not all that different from this one, he had buried her in the backyard and then planted a garden to cover up his crime. Unable to trust his own mind, he walked over to the blanket that he used to cradle his son. But when he pulled it open, it was empty. Anxiety swirled inside of him, and he moaned to release it, but found no solace in his cry. His detachment from reality left him completely incapacitated. He was trapped by what resided beneath his flesh. He returned to the house, intent on grabbing his gun and an old bottle of whiskey, and when he had both, he walked back out to the garden. As he drank, he stared down at his wife's decaying body and felt nothing but sorry for himself. If nature had only afforded him the power to conceive, then all of this could have been avoided. He drained the whiskey, the amber liquid serving as the sand in an hourglass that counted down his final moments on this earth. When its contents ran out, he tossed the bottle aside and then aimed the rifle at his own face. He pulled the trigger. The Garden by Dark Rhodes. I mean, a green thumb is one thing, but maybe that's taking it too far. Anyway, let's move on to lighter matters. How about we see if we have any new Patreon patrons to welcome into the Nocturnal Transmissions family? Oh yes, here we go. New acolytes. Alex Anderson. Hello, Alex. And Austin Walker. Hello, Austin. Hope you're both enjoying our exclusive subscriber episodes. Ooh, as a matter of fact, I think our next one is an exclusive episode. If you're not subscribed, well, you're going to miss out, I'm afraid. Every third episode is just for our Patreon subscribers. That means if you're not subscribed, you're missing out on, let's see, 33.333 recurring percent of our dark tales, approximately. So, patreon.com/nocturnal transmissions. Pop in and have a look at what we have on offer. Alex Anderson and Austin Walker did. All right, that's enough shameless promotion of our Patreon subscriber carry-on. Although, for what it's worth, gentle listener, it's not just about seeking support for the podcast. We really want you to hear the stories we produce for the Patreon faithful. Some of them aren't half bad, and some are truly terrible. In the best possible way, of course. This transmission was transmitted by Nocturnal Transmissions, thanks in no small part to the generous assistance of our Patreon subscribers. A special thank you goes out to our esteemed cohorts. Oh, cohorts from the bottom of our black little heart. Thank you. Kel Wielden, Jimmy Mack, Johnny Kelly, Tippy Polo, Fangora Brown, Andy Shammy, Tim Howard, Bool Swiftney, Wayne Prince, Robert Troy Hampton Peterson, Mudkip, Rebecca Gates, Daniel Kamienkowski, Jerry Taylor, Crunchy Kirby, Daniel Clanton, J.B., Sam Hankins, Rachel Brown, Amanda Moore, Adam, Heathen Soul, Evan Dooley, Alex Brewis, and Drenny. All non-public domain stories are featured with the permission of the authors. All voices and production are concocted by Kristin Holland. Until next time, as always, watch the skies, fear the dark, and don't trust anyone, especially yourself. Good night, gentle listener.
Then that's the time to say good night and close your eyes in sleep. In sleep. Good night, good night. I'll see you in the morning. Good night, good night. I'll see you with a dawning. Sunshine will change the night today. Shadows will all be chased away. It's not goodbye, just time to say good night. Good